Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who don't recognize their own commander. What happens when a decorated military officer, disguised in civilian clothes, faces harassment from her own recruits at the base entrance? This is the true story of Colonel Sarah Mitchell, whose quiet evening walk turned into a shocking revelation that would forever change how respect and authority are understood at Fort Henderson. The incident that followed wasn't just about mistaken identity. It was about courage, leadership, and the moment when power revealed itself in the most unexpected way. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the main entrance of Fort Henderson as Colonel Sarah Mitchell approached the heavily guarded gate. She walked slowly, her civilian clothes, a simple pair of jeans and a worn leather jacket, making her look like any other visitor to the military base. Her short auburn hair was tucked behind her ears, and she carried nothing more than a small purse and her identification card. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another civilian, perhaps a family member coming to visit someone stationed at the base. Sarah had chosen to dress this way intentionally. After 18 years of military service, she had learned the value of observing her troops when they thought no one important was watching. It was a technique she had picked up from her mentor, General Harrison, who had taught her that true leadership meant understanding how soldiers behaved when they believed they were free from scrutiny. Today, she was returning from a 3-day conference in the nearby city, and instead of having her driver pick her up in the official vehicle, she had decided to take a taxi to the main gate and walk through like any other visitor. Fort Henderson was one of the largest military training facilities in the region, housing over 15,000 personnel at any given time. Sarah had been commanding the base for 2 years, but her leadership style was unique. Unlike many commanders who ruled through fear and intimidation, she believed in leading by example and understanding her soldiers on a personal level. She made it a point to know the names of as many personnel as possible, from the newest recruits to the most senior officers. However, with the constant rotation of new trainees and transfers, it was impossible for everyone to know her by sight, especially when she was out of uniform. As she approached the main checkpoint, Sarah noticed the usual bustle of activity. Military vehicles were lined up for inspection, and several groups of recruits were gathered near the visitor processing area. The evening shift change was about to begin, and there was the typical controlled chaos that came with the end of the duty day. Guards were checking identification cards, inspecting vehicles, and managing the flow of people entering and exiting the base. The main gate was staffed by 4 soldiers, all relatively new to the base. Private Johnson, a 22-year-old from Ohio, was manning the primary checkpoint. He had been stationed at Fort Henderson for only 6 weeks and was still learning the procedures. Beside him stood Private Martinez, a confident young man from Texas who had arrived just 2 months earlier. Corporals Brooks and Stevens were supervising the gate area, both having been at the base for less than 4 months. Sarah observed them from a distance as she waited in the short line of civilians being processed. She noted their posture, their interaction with visitors, and their adherence to protocol. Overall, they seemed to be following procedures correctly, but she could sense a certain casualness in their approach that concerned her. There was laughter and joking between them that, while not necessarily inappropriate, suggested they might not be maintaining the level of professional alertness expected at such a critical security point. When it was her turn to approach the checkpoint, Sarah stepped forward with a friendly smile. She reached into her purse and pulled out her military identification card, which clearly displayed her rank, name, and photograph. However, as she extended the card toward Private Johnson, something unexpected happened. Private Martinez, who had been joking with Corporal Brooks, looked up and saw Sarah approaching. Instead of focusing on her identification card, his eyes immediately went to her civilian attire. He nudged Johnson with his elbow and made a comment under his breath that Sarah could hear clearly. "Look at this one," Martinez said with a smirk. "Another civilian thinking she can just waltz onto a military base like she owns the place." Johnson glanced up from the paperwork he was reviewing and looked at Sarah with barely concealed annoyance. Without even reaching for her identification card, he spoke in a dismissive tone. "Ma'am, this is a restricted military installation. Unless you have proper authorization and a valid reason for being here, you need to turn around and leave. We don't have time to deal with lost tourists today." Sarah's expression remained calm, but internally she was shocked by the complete breach of protocol she was witnessing. The proper procedure was to always check identification first, regardless of how someone was dressed or what assumptions the guards might have about them. She decided to give them a chance to correct their mistake. "I do have proper identification," she said politely, again extending her military ID card toward Johnson. If you could please check this, you'll see that I have every right to be on this base. But instead of taking the card, Corporal Brooks stepped forward with an attitude that made Sarah's blood pressure rise. His voice was loud enough for other people in the area to hear, and his tone was condescending. Lady, I don't know what part of restricted military installation you don't understand, but you need to move along. This isn't some public park where you can just walk around taking pictures or whatever it is you civilians do for fun. We have real work to do here, and we don't have time to babysit lost visitors. The situation was rapidly escalating, and Sarah could see that other personnel in the area were beginning to take notice of the commotion. But several recruits had stopped their conversations and were watching the exchange with interest. Some were even beginning to smile and whisper among themselves, apparently finding entertainment in what they perceived as guards putting a pushy civilian in her place. Sarah took a deep breath and made one more attempt to resolve the situation peacefully. She held up her identification card again, this time speaking more firmly. Soldiers, I am ordering you to examine this identification card immediately. You are violating standard security protocol by refusing to check proper documentation. This statement only seemed to anger the guards further. Corporal Stevens, who had been watching from a few feet away, now joined the confrontation. His face was red with irritation, and his voice carried across the entire gate area. Ordering us? Lady, you are way out of line. You don't order anyone around here. You're not military. You're not our superior, and you certainly don't have any authority to tell us how to do our jobs. In fact, your attitude is starting to make me think you might be some kind of security threat. The mention of security threat caused an immediate shift in the atmosphere. Several more soldiers began to gather around, and Sarah could see that the situation was about to become much more serious. In the military, any mention of a potential security threat triggered specific protocols that could lead to detention, extensive questioning, and a complete lockdown of the affected area. Private Johnson, apparently emboldened by the support of his colleagues, stepped closer to Sarah with an aggressive posture. His voice was now openly hostile. You know what? I think we need to detain this woman for questioning. She's clearly trying to gain unauthorized access to the base. She's refusing to follow lawful orders to leave, and now she's claiming to have authority over military personnel. That sounds like suspicious behavior to me. Sarah realized that the situation had moved far beyond a simple misunderstanding. These soldiers were not just failing to follow protocol, they were actively threatening to detain their commanding officer based on nothing more than her civilian clothing and their own prejudices. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. She was about to be arrested by her own troops for trying to enter her own base. However, Sarah was not just any officer. She had not risen to the rank of colonel and been given command of one of the nation's largest training facilities by accident. She had earned her position through years of dedicated service, multiple combat deployments, and a reputation for being both fair and decisive under pressure. She had commanded troops in hostile territories, managed complex military operations, and earned the respect of her peers throughout the military hierarchy. As the guards moved closer, Sarah made a decision. She would allow this situation to play out just a little bit further, but she was already formulating a plan that would turn this incident into a teaching moment that no one at Fort Henderson would ever forget. She had spent her entire career fighting for respect and equality in a male-dominated profession, and she was not about to let a group of inexperienced recruits undermine the authority that she had worked so hard to earn. The crowd of onlookers continued to grow, and Sarah could see that news of the confrontation was spreading quickly throughout the immediate area. Soldiers were pulling out their phones, and she knew that within minutes, word of this incident would be traveling through the base communication networks. What these guards didn't realize was that they were about to become the subject of a story that would be told and retold for years to come. Sarah straightened her shoulders, looked directly at Corporal Stevens, and spoke in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Soldier, you have exactly 10 seconds to examine my identification card, or you are going to face consequences that will follow you for the rest of your military career. I am giving you one final opportunity to do your job correctly before this situation becomes something that neither you nor your colleagues will be able to explain to your superior officers. But the warning only seemed to fuel their aggressive behavior. The 4 guards moved to surround Sarah, and Johnson reached for his radio to call for backup. In their minds, they were dealing with an increasingly hostile civilian who was now making threats against military personnel. They had no idea that they were about to make the biggest mistake of their young military careers. Private Johnson's hand moved toward his radio, but before he could key the microphone, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. It came from behind the group of guards carrying an authority that immediately commanded attention from everyone in the area. What exactly is going on here? The voice belonged to Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who served as the base's senior enlisted advisor for security operations. Rodriguez had been crossing the compound when he noticed the commotion at the main gate, and his experienced eye immediately recognized that something was seriously wrong with the situation he was observing. Rodriguez was exactly the kind of soldier that Sarah respected most. Professional, experienced, and completely dedicated to maintaining the highest standards of military conduct. He had served under multiple commanders during his career, and he had developed an instinct for recognizing when situations were about to spiral out of control. As he approached the group, his eyes quickly took in the scene. 4 junior enlisted personnel surrounding a lone civilian woman, their body language aggressive and confrontational. "Master Sergeant," Corporal Brooks said, clearly relieved to see a senior enlisted leader arrive on the scene. "We have a civilian here who is trying to force her way onto the base without proper authorization. She's been argumentative and uncooperative, and she's making threats against military personnel." Rodriguez looked at Sarah carefully, noting her calm demeanor despite being surrounded by hostile soldiers. Something about her posture and the way she carried herself seemed familiar, but he couldn't immediately place where he might have seen her before. His years of experience had taught him to be suspicious of any situation where multiple soldiers were ganging up on a single individual, regardless of whether that person was military or civilian. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, addressing Sarah directly, "could you please explain your side of what's happening here?" Sarah looked at Rodriguez with a slight smile. She recognized him, of course. He had been serving at Fort Henderson since before her arrival as commanding officer, and she had worked with him on numerous occasions. However, like the guards, he was seeing her out of uniform for the first time. And in the context of this confrontational situation, he hadn't yet made the connection. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah said, using his name deliberately, "I simply tried to enter the base using my proper military identification, but these soldiers refused to examine my credentials. Instead, they made assumptions based on my civilian clothing and have now threatened to detain me as a security risk." The use of his name caught Rodriguez's attention immediately. Very few civilians would know his name or rank, and the way she had spoken indicated familiarity with military protocol and hierarchy. He also noticed that despite being surrounded by increasingly agitated soldiers, the woman showed no signs of fear or anxiety. In fact, she seemed almost amused by the entire situation. "Ma'am, if you have proper identification, I'd be happy to examine it and resolve this situation quickly," Rodriguez said, extending his hand. But before Sarah could respond, Private Martinez stepped forward aggressively. His earlier bravado had been reinforced by what he perceived as support from his fellow guards, and the arrival of additional personnel only seemed to make him more confident in his actions. "Master Sergeant, don't let her fool you with that polite act. She's been trying to manipulate us from the beginning. First she claimed to have proper ID. Then she started giving us orders like she was some kind of officer. Now she's trying to act all friendly and cooperative because she sees you here. This is exactly the kind of behavior we're trained to watch out for. People who try to talk their way past security using psychological tricks." Rodriguez's expression grew stern as he listened to Martinez's explanation. The young soldier's attitude troubled him deeply. In his 20 years of military service, Rodriguez had learned that the best way to handle any security situation was to remain calm, follow established protocols, and never let personal emotions or assumptions cloud professional judgment. What he was witnessing from these guards was the exact opposite of everything he had tried to teach them about proper military bearing. "Private Martinez," Rodriguez said in a voice that carried clear warning, "your job at this gate is to check identification and follow security protocols, not to make character judgments about people based on their appearance or your personal feelings. Now step back and let me handle this situation properly." But the damage had already been done. Word of the confrontation had spread throughout the immediate area, and more soldiers were gathering to watch what was developing into a significant incident. Sarah could see personnel from various units stopping their activities to observe the drama unfolding at the main gate. Some were taking pictures and videos with their phones, ensuring that whatever happened next would be preserved and shared throughout the base network. Among the growing crowd of spectators was Lieutenant Thompson, a young officer who had arrived at Fort Henderson just 3 weeks earlier. Thompson was fresh out of officer candidate school and was still learning how to navigate the complex dynamics of military leadership. When he saw what appeared to be a civilian causing problems at the main gate, his first instinct was to support his enlisted personnel and demonstrate his authority as an officer. "What's the situation here, Master Sergeant?" Thompson asked as he approached the group, his voice carrying the slightly forced confidence of someone trying to project authority he wasn't entirely sure he possessed. "Sir, we have a civilian who claims to have proper identification but who has been uncooperative with gate security," Rodriguez replied, though Sarah could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Something about the entire situation was bothering him, and his instincts were telling him that there was more to this story than what appeared on the surface. Lieutenant Thompson looked at Sarah with the same dismissive attitude that the guards had shown. His inexperience and desire to impress his enlisted personnel led him to make the same mistake that had started this entire confrontation. He made assumptions based on appearance rather than following proper procedures. "Ma'am, I don't know what kind of problems you're trying to cause here, but this is a United States military installation, and we take security very seriously. If our gate guards have determined that you don't have proper authorization to be here, then you need to leave immediately. Any further resistance could result in charges being filed against you." Sarah looked at the young lieutenant with a mixture of disappointment and growing anger. This was exactly the kind of leadership failure that she had spent her career trying to eliminate from the military. Thompson was so concerned with appearing tough and authoritative that he had failed to gather basic facts about the situation before making threats and ultimatums. The crowd of onlookers continued to grow, and Sarah could see that the incident was attracting attention from personnel throughout the base. She spotted several senior enlisted leaders and mid-level officers among the spectators, and she knew that her next actions would be witnessed by a significant portion of Fort Henderson's leadership structure. "Lieutenant Thompson," Sarah said, her voice now carrying an edge that made several people in the crowd take notice. "Before you make any more statements or threats, I strongly suggest that you direct one of these soldiers to examine my military identification card. You might find the results very enlightening." Thompson, however, interpreted her suggestion as a challenge to his authority. His face flushed red, and his voice rose to a level that could be heard clearly throughout the entire gate area. "That's enough. I am a commissioned officer in the United States Army, and I don't take suggestions from civilians. You have been asked repeatedly to leave this installation, and your continued presence here is now constituting trespassing on federal property. Guards, I want this woman detained immediately while we sort out whether criminal charges need to be filed." The order to detain her was the final straw for Sarah. She had given these soldiers multiple opportunities to do their jobs correctly, and they had consistently chosen to escalate the situation based on their prejudices and assumptions rather than following basic military protocols. What made the situation even more infuriating was that their behavior was being witnessed by dozens of other military personnel, many of whom were now taking pictures and recording videos that would undoubtedly be shared far beyond Fort Henderson. As the guards moved to carry out Thompson's order, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to play along with their assumptions, she decided it was time to reveal exactly who they were dealing with. But she wouldn't do it in the way they expected. Rather than simply showing her identification card, Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out her cell phone. The guards hesitated, unsure whether they should allow her to make a phone call before detaining her. In that moment of uncertainty, Sarah pressed a speed dial number that connected her directly to the base command center. The phone was answered on the first ring by Sergeant Major Williams, the senior enlisted advisor to the base commander, a position that reported directly to Sarah herself. "Command Center, Sergeant Major Williams speaking," came the crisp professional voice through the phone speaker, which Sarah had deliberately activated so that everyone in the area could hear the conversation. "Sergeant Major Williams, this is Colonel Mitchell," Sarah said in her official command voice, the tone immediately recognizing by anyone who had ever served under her leadership. "I need you to dispatch the officer of the day and the sergeant major of the day to the main gate immediately. We have a significant situation here that requires immediate attention from senior leadership." The effect of her words was instantaneous and dramatic. The casual conversations among the spectators stopped abruptly, and a shocked silence fell over the entire gate area. Private Johnson's face went completely white as he realized what he had just heard. Corporal Brooks took an involuntary step backward, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. Private Martinez looked like he was about to be sick, and Corporal Stevens stood frozen in place, unable to process what had just happened. Lieutenant Thompson's reaction was the most dramatic of all. The color drained from his face, and for a moment Sarah thought he might actually faint. His hands began to shake visibly, and when he tried to speak, only a strangled whisper came out. "Sergeant Major Williams," Sarah continued, her voice now carrying the full authority of someone accustomed to commanding thousands of troops, "please also contact the Provost Marshal and have him report to this location. We have multiple violations of security protocol, failure to follow basic military procedures, and what appears to be a complete breakdown in discipline among gate security personnel." The phone call continued for another 30 seconds, with Sarah providing specific details about the incident and issuing precise instructions for how the situation should be handled. Every word was heard clearly by the growing crowd of spectators, and the reality of what had just happened was sinking in among everyone present. When Sarah ended the call and looked up at the group of soldiers who had been threatening to arrest her just moments before, the power dynamic had shifted completely. These were no longer guards dealing with a troublesome civilian. These were soldiers who had just realized they had been threatening, insulting, and attempting to detain the commanding officer of their entire base. The silence that followed Sarah's phone call was deafening. In the space of 30 seconds, the entire dynamic at the gate had transformed from what the guards believed was a routine confrontation with a difficult civilian into the realization that they had just committed one of the most serious breaches of military protocol imaginable. The four soldiers who had been so confident and aggressive just moments before now stood frozen, their faces displaying a mixture of horror, disbelief, and growing panic. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to recover from the shock. His 20 years of military experience had exposed him to many unexpected situations, but even he had never witnessed anything quite like this. As the reality of what had just occurred sank in, his professional instincts kicked in, and he immediately moved to try to salvage what was rapidly becoming an unmitigated disaster. "Colonel Mitchell," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying both respect and deep embarrassment. "Ma'am, I sincerely apologize for this incident. These soldiers failed to follow proper procedures, and I take full responsibility for their actions as the senior enlisted leader present." Sarah looked at Rodriguez with an expression that was difficult to read. She had worked with him extensively during her time as base commander, and she knew him to be a competent and dedicated soldier. However, she also knew that this incident represented much more than just a failure by individual guards. It revealed systemic problems in training, leadership, and military culture that needed to be addressed immediately. "Master Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah replied, her voice maintaining the formal tone appropriate for such a serious situation. "While I appreciate your willingness to accept responsibility, this incident involves far more than just procedural failures. What I witnessed here today represents a complete breakdown in military discipline, professional conduct, and basic respect for authority." The crowd of spectators had continued to grow, and Sarah could see that word of the incident was spreading rapidly throughout the base. Soldiers from various units were abandoning their duties to come and witness what was clearly going to become legendary within Fort Henderson's history. Many were still recording the events on their phones, ensuring that the confrontation and its aftermath would be preserved and shared far beyond the base boundaries. Private Johnson, who had been standing motionless since hearing Sarah identify herself, finally found his voice. His words came out as barely audible whispers, and his hands were shaking so violently that he had to clasp them behind his back to try to maintain some semblance of military bearing. "Ma'am." "Colonel, we didn't know. Your identification. We should have." Johnson's attempt to speak coherently failed completely as the full implications of his actions became clear to him. He had not only refused to examine the identification card of his commanding officer, but he had also threatened to have her detained as a security risk. Sarah looked at Johnson with an expression that mixed disappointment with something that might have been pity. She had been in the military long enough to understand how panic and fear could overwhelm young soldiers, but she also knew that this incident could not be dismissed as simply a case of mistaken identity. The attitudes and behaviors she had witnessed revealed deeper problems that had to be addressed. Private Martinez, whose aggressive behavior and disrespectful comments had been among the most egregious aspects of the entire incident, was visibly struggling to maintain his composure. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely, and he was now facing the reality that his military career might be over before it had truly begun. The things he had said about Sarah, the dismissive and condescending tone he had used, and his threats to detain her, were all documented by multiple witnesses and recorded on numerous phones. "Colonel Mitchell," Martinez said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Ma'am, I made a terrible mistake. I said things that were completely inappropriate and unprofessional. I have no excuse for my behavior, and I accept full responsibility for my actions. Sarah nodded acknowledgement of his statement but did not respond immediately. She was using this time not only to let the full weight of the situation sink in among all the soldiers present, but also to observe their reactions and assess how each individual was handling the crisis. These observations would be crucial in determining appropriate consequences and developing training programs to prevent similar incidents in the future. Lieutenant Thompson, meanwhile, was experiencing what could only be described as a complete emotional collapse. As a newly commissioned officer, he understood that his actions during this incident could effectively end his military career before it had barely started. He had not only failed to follow proper procedures himself, but he had also ordered the detention of his base commander while threatening her with criminal charges. The magnitude of his failures was almost incomprehensible. "Colonel Mitchell," Thompson said, his voice barely above a whisper, "Ma'am, I have failed you. I have failed the Army, and I have failed myself. My actions today were inexcusable, and I understand that there will be serious consequences. I don't even know how to begin to apologize for what I've done." The arrival of the officer of the day interrupted Thompson's attempt at an apology. Major Peterson, a seasoned officer with 15 years of military experience, had been serving as the OD when he received the emergency call from the command center. He had rushed to the main gate, expecting to find some kind of security incident, but what he discovered was far more complex and potentially damaging than anything he had anticipated. "Colonel Mitchell," Major Peterson said as he approached, rendering a crisp salute that was immediately returned. "Ma'am, I came as quickly as possible." "Sergeant Major Williams briefed me on the general situation, but I'd like to hear directly from you about what occurred here." Sarah returned Peterson's salute and then looked around at the assembled crowd of soldiers, many of whom were still recording the events with their phones. She realized that her next words would be heard and analyzed by hundreds of military personnel, and that her response to this incident would set important precedents for how similar situations would be handled in the future. "Major Peterson," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly across the entire area, "what occurred here today represents one of the most serious breaches of military protocol and professional conduct that I have encountered during my 18 years of service. 4 soldiers assigned to gate security duties refused to examine proper military identification, made assumptions based solely on civilian clothing, used disrespectful and unprofessional language, threatened to detain a superior officer, and demonstrated a complete lack of understanding of basic military courtesies and procedures." As Sarah spoke, more senior leadership continued to arrive at the scene. Sergeant Major Williams, the base's senior enlisted advisor, had arrived along with the Provost Marshal and several other key personnel from the command structure. Each new arrival was quickly briefed on the situation, and Sarah could see the shock and concern on their faces as they learned the details of what had transpired. Sergeant Major Williams, a 30-year veteran who had served at bases around the world, approached Sarah with an expression of deep embarrassment and professional concern. As the senior enlisted leader on the base, he felt personally responsible for the failures in training and leadership that had contributed to this incident. "Colonel Mitchell," Williams said, his voice reflecting both respect and genuine remorse, "Ma'am, this incident represents a failure at multiple levels of our organization. The soldiers involved failed to follow basic procedures, but more importantly, our training programs and leadership oversight have clearly been inadequate. I accept full responsibility for these systemic failures." Sarah appreciated Williams's willingness to accept responsibility, but she also knew that this incident had exposed problems that went beyond individual failures or even training deficiencies. The attitudes and behaviors she had witnessed suggested cultural issues within the organization that would require comprehensive and sustained efforts to address. The Provost Marshal, Colonel Davis, had been taking detailed notes throughout the various conversations and had been quietly interviewing witnesses to gather a complete picture of what had occurred. As the base's senior law enforcement officer, he was particularly concerned about the potential legal and administrative consequences of the incident. "Colonel Mitchell," Davis said, approaching with his notebook in hand, "Ma'am, I've interviewed several witnesses and reviewed some of the video recordings that were taken during the incident. Based on my preliminary investigation, we have clear violations of multiple military regulations, potential charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and serious questions about the adequacy of our current training and oversight procedures." The mention of potential UCMJ charges caused a visible reaction among the 4 soldiers who had been involved in the original confrontation. They understood that they were no longer just facing administrative discipline or additional training. They were potentially looking at formal military justice proceedings that could result in reduction in rank, forfeit of pay, restriction to base, or even separation from the service. Sarah looked around at all the personnel who had gathered at the gate, from the most junior enlisted soldiers to senior officers and enlisted leaders. She realized that this moment represented an opportunity to address not just the specific failures that had occurred today, but also the broader issues of respect, professionalism, and military bearing that affected the entire base community. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah said, raising her voice so that everyone in the area could hear her clearly, "what happened here today is not just about 4 individuals who made poor decisions. This incident reflects on all of us as military professionals, and it highlights the need for every member of this command to examine their own attitudes, behaviors, and commitment to the values we are sworn to uphold." She paused to let her words sink in before continuing. "The military is built on a foundation of mutual respect, professional competence, and adherence to established procedures. When any of us fails to meet these standards, we weaken the entire organization and undermine the trust that the American people place in us as their guardians." The crowd listened in absolute silence as Sarah continued her impromptu address. Many of the younger soldiers had never heard their commanding officers speak so directly about such fundamental issues, and the impact of her words was evident on their faces. "Moving forward," Sarah continued, "this incident will serve as a catalyst for comprehensive review and improvement of our training programs, our leadership development procedures, and our organizational culture. Every member of this command will participate in renewed training on military customs and courtesies, security procedures, and professional conduct. We will use this failure as an opportunity to become better soldiers and better leaders." As Sarah finished speaking, she looked directly at the 4 soldiers who had started this entire chain of events. Their faces showed a mixture of relief that they were not being subjected to immediate punishment and anxiety about what consequences they would ultimately face. Sarah knew that the decisions she made about their cases would be watched carefully by every soldier on the base and would send important messages about accountability, leadership, and the possibility of redemption after serious mistakes. The following morning brought a flurry of activity throughout Fort Henderson as news of the gate incident spread beyond the base boundaries. Sarah's phone had been ringing constantly since dawn, with calls from higher headquarters, media inquiries, and messages from colleagues at other installations who had heard various versions of the story. The age of social media meant that the videos recorded by witnesses had already been viewed thousands of times, and the incident was becoming a case study that would be discussed in military leadership courses for years to come. Sarah sat in her office reviewing the preliminary reports that had been submitted by the Provost Marshal, the officer of the day, and various witnesses to the incident. Each account painted a consistent picture of systematic failures in training, leadership, and professional conduct that went far beyond the actions of 4 individual soldiers. The more she studied the details, the more convinced she became that this incident represented an opportunity to address fundamental issues that had been brewing beneath the surface for months. Her first meeting of the day was with Sergeant Major Williams and the senior leadership team. As they gathered in the conference room adjacent to her office, Sarah could see the concern and embarrassment on their faces. These were experienced military professionals who took pride in their units and their soldiers, and the previous day's events had shaken their confidence in the systems they had worked years to develop. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began as the meeting came to order, "yesterday's incident at the main gate has exposed serious deficiencies in our organization that we must address immediately and comprehensively. While it would be easy to focus solely on punishing the individuals involved, that approach would miss the larger lessons that we need to learn from this situation." Major Peterson, who had served as officer of the day during the incident, was the first to speak. His experience in handling various base emergencies had not prepared him for dealing with a situation where soldiers had unknowingly confronted their own commanding officer. "Colonel, ma'am, I've been thinking about this situation all night, and I believe we're dealing with multiple systemic failures. Our gate security training clearly needs to be revamped. Our procedures for verifying identification need to be reinforced, and most importantly, we need to address the attitudes and assumptions that led to this confrontation in the first place." Sarah nodded in agreement with Peterson's assessment. "Major Peterson, you've identified several key issues, but I think the problem goes even deeper than that. What I witnessed yesterday was not just procedural failure. It was a fundamental breakdown in military bearing, respect for authority, and professional conduct. These are values that should be so deeply ingrained in our soldiers that they guide behavior even in unexpected or stressful situations. Sergeant Major Williams shifted uncomfortably in his chair before speaking. As the senior enlisted leader on the base, he felt personally responsible for the failures in leadership and training that had contributed to the incident. Colonel Mitchell, ma'am, I've been reviewing our training records and conducting informal interviews with soldiers throughout the base. What I'm discovering is that we have significant gaps in our professional development programs, particularly for our newer soldiers. Many of them have received technical training for their specific jobs, but they haven't received adequate instruction in military customs, courtesies, and the broader principles of military professionalism. The Provost Marshal, Colonel Davis, had spent the night reviewing regulations and precedents for handling incidents of this type. His legal background and experience with military justice issues gave him a unique perspective on the potential consequences of the situation. Colonel Mitchell, Davis said, consulting his notes, from a legal standpoint, we have clear violations of several articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The soldiers involved could potentially face charges ranging from failure to obey lawful orders to conduct unbecoming a military member. However, I believe our focus should be on corrective action and systemic improvements rather than purely punitive measures. Sarah appreciated Davis's balanced approach to the legal aspects of the case. While accountability was essential, she was more interested in using this incident to create positive change throughout the organization than in destroying the careers of 4 young soldiers who had made serious mistakes. Colonel Davis, I agree that our primary focus should be on institutional improvements, but we also cannot ignore the need for appropriate consequences. The soldiers involved demonstrated serious failures in judgment and professionalism that cannot be overlooked. However, I'm more interested in consequences that promote learning and growth rather than simply punishment. The discussion continued for nearly 2 hours as the leadership team analyzed every aspect of the incident and developed a comprehensive plan for addressing the issues it had revealed. They examined training curricula, leadership development programs, and organizational culture initiatives that could help prevent similar incidents in the future. Meanwhile, throughout the base, the 4 soldiers who had been involved in the original confrontation were experiencing very different reactions to their situation. Private Johnson had barely slept and had spent most of the night replaying the events in his mind, trying to understand how he had made such catastrophic errors in judgment. His roommate had found him sitting on his bunk at 3 a.m, staring at the wall and muttering apologies to no one in particular. Private Martinez was dealing with his situation differently. While he was clearly shaken by what had occurred, he was also angry at what he perceived as an unfair test or trick that had been played on him and his colleagues. In his mind, it wasn't reasonable to expect soldiers to recognize their commanding officer when she was dressed in civilian clothes and approaching the gate like any other visitor. Corporals Brooks and Stevens, as the senior enlisted personnel involved in the incident, understood that they faced potentially more serious consequences than the privates. They had been in the military longer and should have known better. And their leadership positions made their failures even more significant. Both had been scheduled for promotion to sergeant within the next few months. But they now realized that those promotions were almost certainly going to be cancelled. The story of the gate incident had also reached the families and friends of the soldiers involved. Parents, spouses, and siblings had been calling throughout the night asking for details about what had happened and what consequences their loved ones might face. The base public affairs office had been inundated with media requests, and several national news organizations were already preparing stories about the incident. By mid-morning, Sarah had made several key decisions about how to handle the immediate aftermath of the incident. Her first priority was to ensure that the 4 soldiers involved received appropriate counseling and support while the investigation and disciplinary process moved forward. Despite their serious errors in judgment, she recognized that they were still members of her command who deserved to be treated with dignity and fairness. Her second priority was to begin implementing immediate changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. She ordered a comprehensive review of all gate security procedures, mandated additional training for all personnel assigned to security duties, and established new protocols for handling unusual or unexpected situations. Sarah's third priority was to address the broader organizational and cultural issues that had contributed to the incident. She scheduled a series of town hall meetings with soldiers throughout the base, initiated a review of all professional development programs, and began planning a comprehensive campaign to reinforce military values and standards. The first of these town hall meetings was scheduled for that afternoon in the base's largest auditorium. Word had spread quickly throughout Fort Henderson that the commanding officer would be addressing the previous day's incident directly, and Sarah knew that the auditorium would be packed with soldiers eager to hear her perspective on what had happened. As she prepared her remarks for the meeting, Sarah reflected on the broader implications of the gate incident. In many ways, what had happened was emblematic of challenges facing the entire military in an era of rapid social change, evolving technology, and shifting cultural norms. The traditional hierarchical structure of the military was being tested by soldiers who had grown up in more egalitarian societies and who sometimes struggled with concepts of automatic respect for authority. At the same time, Sarah recognized that the incident also revealed positive aspects of military culture. The immediate response by senior leaders, the willingness of personnel to accept responsibility for failures, and the commitment to learning from mistakes all demonstrated the values and principles that made the military special. The challenge was to build on these positive elements while addressing the deficiencies that had been exposed. The afternoon town hall meeting drew an overflow crowd of more than 2,000 soldiers, with additional personnel watching via live stream from locations throughout the base. As Sarah took the stage, she could see a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and respect on the faces looking back at her. She knew that her words would be analyzed and discussed for months to come, and that this moment represented a crucial opportunity to provide leadership and direction for her entire command. "Soldiers of Fort Henderson," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly throughout the packed auditorium. "Yesterday's incident at our main gate has provided all of us with an opportunity to examine our standards, our values, and our commitment to the principles that define us as military professionals." While the immediate cause of the confrontation was a failure to follow proper identification procedures, the deeper issues involved questions of respect, professionalism, and military bearing that affect every member of this command. She paused to let her words sink in before continuing. "I want to be very clear about something from the beginning. What happened yesterday was not the result of malicious intent or deliberate misconduct. The soldiers involved made serious errors in judgment, but they were trying to do their jobs and protect this installation. Their mistakes were the result of inadequate training, insufficient experience, and assumptions that led them to make poor decisions under pressure." Sarah could see visible relief on many faces in the audience as she acknowledged that the incident was not being treated as deliberate misconduct. However, she also knew that she needed to make clear that serious mistakes, even when made with good intentions, still had significant consequences. "However," Sarah continued, her tone becoming more serious, "good intentions do not excuse failures in professional conduct, violations of established procedures, or disrespectful treatment of fellow service members. The military is built on a foundation of discipline, respect, and adherence to standards, and when we fail to meet these expectations, we weaken the entire organization." The auditorium remained completely silent as Sarah outlined her expectations for how similar situations should be handled in the future, described the changes that would be implemented immediately, and challenged every soldier present to examine their own attitudes and behaviors to ensure they were meeting the highest standards of military professionalism. 6 months after the gate incident, Fort Henderson had undergone a transformation that surprised even Sarah with its scope and depth. What had begun as an embarrassing confrontation between guards and their commanding officer had evolved into a comprehensive reformation of military culture, training procedures, and leadership development throughout the installation. The changes implemented in response to the incident had attracted attention from military installations around the world, and Fort Henderson was now being studied as a model for how organizations could turn failures into opportunities for growth and improvement. The 4 soldiers who had been involved in the original incident had all chosen different paths in response to their experiences. Private Johnson had initially considered requesting a transfer to another base, but after extensive counseling and mentoring, he had decided to stay at Fort Henderson and rebuild his military career. He had thrown himself into professional development programs, volunteered for additional training opportunities, and had become one of the most knowledgeable and professional soldiers in his unit. His transformation had been so dramatic that he was being considered for early promotion and selection for advanced military education programs. Private Martinez had struggled more with accepting responsibility for his role in the incident. His initial anger and resentment had required extensive counseling and mentoring from senior enlisted leaders before he could begin to understand how his attitudes and behaviors had contributed to the confrontation. However, once he had worked through these issues, he had become an advocate for the cultural changes being implemented throughout the base. He had volunteered to serve on committees developing new training programs and had shared his experiences with incoming soldiers as part of their orientation process. Corporals Brooks and Stevens had faced the most serious consequences for their actions, as their rank and experience had made their failures more significant. Both had been reduced in rank and had their planned promotions cancelled. But they had also been given opportunities to earn back their positions through demonstrated improvement in performance and leadership. Brooks had taken advantage of these opportunities and had recently been promoted back to his original rank, while Stevens was still working to prove that he had learned from his mistakes. Lieutenant Thompson's case had been the most complex of all. As a commissioned officer, his failures during the incident had raised serious questions about his potential for military leadership. He had been subjected to extensive evaluation and counseling, and for several months his future in the military had been uncertain. However, his genuine remorse, his commitment to learning from his mistakes, and his demonstrated growth in the months following the incident had ultimately saved his career. He had been assigned to work directly under Sarah's mentorship and had developed into a competent and respected leader. The broader changes implemented at Fort Henderson had been even more significant than the individual transformations. Sarah had used the incident as a catalyst for examining every aspect of base operations, from initial training programs for new arrivals to leadership development for senior personnel. The gate security procedures had been completely overhauled, with new protocols that emphasized thorough verification of credentials regardless of an individual's appearance or assumed status. More importantly, Sarah had implemented a comprehensive program focused on military customs, courtesies, and professional conduct that was now being replicated at bases throughout the military. This program emphasized not just the technical aspects of military protocol, but the underlying values and principles that made such protocols meaningful. Soldiers were taught not just what to do in various situations, but why these behaviors were important for maintaining unit cohesion, mission effectiveness, and the trust between military personnel and the civilians they served. The incident had also sparked a broader conversation within the military about issues of respect, authority, and professional conduct in an era of changing social norms. Sarah had been invited to speak at military leadership conferences around the world, sharing lessons learned from the Fort Henderson experience and discussing how military organizations could adapt to contemporary challenges while maintaining their essential character and effectiveness. The media coverage of the incident and its aftermath had also been largely positive, with many news organizations focusing on the military's willingness to learn from mistakes and implement meaningful reforms. Several articles had highlighted Sarah's leadership during the crisis and her innovative approach to turning a potentially damaging incident into an opportunity for organizational improvement. 1 year after the incident, Sarah was preparing to leave Fort Henderson for a new assignment at the Pentagon, where she would be working on military leadership development policy for the entire Army. As she cleaned out her office and prepared for the change of command ceremony that would transfer her responsibilities to her successor, she reflected on the lessons learned from what had become known throughout the military as the Gate Incident. The most important lesson, in Sarah's view, was that true leadership meant taking responsibility not just for successes, but for failures as well. The soldiers who had confronted her at the gate had been products of the systems, culture, and training programs that she and other leaders had created. Rather than simply punishing them for their mistakes, she had chosen to examine how those mistakes had been allowed to happen and what could be done to prevent similar problems in the future. The second major lesson was that organizational culture could not be changed through orders or regulations alone. The transformation at Fort Henderson had required sustained effort, consistent messaging, and demonstrated commitment from leaders at every level. It had taken months of town hall meetings, training sessions, mentoring programs, and personal example before the new standards and expectations had become truly embedded in the base's culture. The third lesson was that mistakes, even serious ones, could become opportunities for growth and improvement if they were handled correctly. The 4 soldiers involved in the original incident had all gone on to successful military careers, and their experiences had been used to help train thousands of other soldiers. Rather than trying to hide or minimize the incident, Sarah had used it as a teaching tool that had ultimately made the entire organization stronger. As Sarah prepared for her farewell speech at the change of command ceremony, she thought about the legacy she was leaving at Fort Henderson. The incident at the gate had been embarrassing and potentially damaging, but the response to it had created lasting positive changes that would benefit the military for years to come. The new training programs, leadership development initiatives, and cultural reforms that had emerged from the crisis were now being adopted by military installations around the world. The ceremony itself was attended by hundreds of personnel from Fort Henderson, as well as senior leaders from throughout the military establishment. As Sarah stood at the podium delivering her final remarks as base commander, she could see many of the people who had been part of the transformation that had followed the gate incident. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had arrived on the scene that day and had helped to calm the initial confrontation, was now serving as the senior enlisted advisor at another major installation. Major Peterson, who had served as officer of the day during the incident, had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and was commanding his own unit. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah said as she began her farewell address, "my time at Fort Henderson has been marked by many memorable experiences, but none more significant than an incident that occurred at our main gate over a year ago. That confrontation, which could have been viewed as simply an embarrassing mistake, became instead the catalyst for positive changes that have transformed this installation and influenced military leadership development throughout our armed forces."
They paused to look out at the audience, many of whom had been part of the transformation process.
"The lesson I hope you will take from our shared experience is that true strength lies not in avoiding mistakes, but in learning from them and using them to become better than we were before. The soldiers who confronted me at that gate made serious errors in judgment, but they also provided our entire organization with an opportunity to examine our values, improve our procedures, and strengthen our commitment to the principles that define us as military professionals." Sarah continued her remarks for another 10 minutes, highlighting the specific changes that had been implemented and recognizing the individuals who had contributed to the transformation of Fort Henderson. She spoke about the importance of leadership, the value of learning from failure, and the ongoing responsibility that all military personnel shared for maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct. As the ceremony concluded and Sarah prepared to leave Fort Henderson for the last time as its commanding officer, she was approached by Private Johnson, who had requested permission to speak with her privately. He stood at attention and rendered a perfect salute, which she returned with the same precision and respect she had shown to generals and senior officials. "Colonel Mitchell, ma'am," Johnson said, his voice carrying the confidence and professionalism that had replaced the nervous uncertainty she remembered from their first encounter. "I wanted to thank you personally for the way you handled the situation at the gate and for the opportunities you gave me to learn from my mistakes and grow as a soldier. What happened that day was the worst moment of my military career, but it also became the foundation for everything good that has happened to me since then." Sarah smiled as she listened to Johnson's words. His transformation from the panicked young soldier who had refused to check her identification to the confident professional military member standing before her represented everything she had hoped to achieve through the reforms implemented after the incident. "Private Johnson," Sarah replied, using the rank he had earned back through his demonstrated growth and commitment, "your willingness to learn from that experience and use it to become a better soldier is exactly what military service is about. You faced a difficult situation, made mistakes, accepted responsibility, and worked to improve yourself. That's the kind of character and professionalism that makes our military strong." As Sarah walked away from Fort Henderson that day, she carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that a potentially devastating incident had been transformed into one of the most successful leadership and organizational development initiatives in recent military history. The Gate incident, as it had come to be known, would continue to influence military training and leadership development for years to come, serving as a powerful reminder that even the most serious mistakes could become opportunities for growth, learning, and positive change when handled with wisdom, courage, and commitment to the values that define military service. The story of Colonel Sarah Mitchell and the 4 soldiers who unknowingly confronted their commanding officer had become legendary within military circles, but its true significance lay not in the drama of the original incident, but in the transformation that had followed. It stood as a testament to the power of authentic leadership, the importance of organizational culture, and the possibility of turning failure into lasting success through commitment to continuous improvement and unwavering dedication to the highest standards of military professionalism.